26 and verse number 5. Genesis 26 and verse number 5. Hear what God is saying. This is God speaking.
Because that Abraham obeyed my voice.
Who is speaking? God.
It's the Lord.
Yeah. God is saying Abraham obeyed. There is an obedience.
My voice.
This is not Moses. This is Abraham before the law of Moses. Abraham is obeying a voice that talks to him. So he's being given instructions by the voice. Before you think of any voluntary action, there is a voice. Number 2.
And kept my charge.
He kept my charge.
My commandments.
My commandments. Before the 10 commandments were ever given. And my what again?
My statutes.
My statutes and
my laws.
My laws. Abraham was under the law.
Wow.
So if you are to find him paying tithe, do not make assumptions that he was not following a law. Because I have to work on that. Please, as long as you live, as long as you study this word, always remember this part, because this is how they massacre scriptures. This is how they slaughter scriptures. Just to get you to disobey an order that has directly come from the Lord. They say Abraham wasn't following anything. It was out of his own will. And why should we command people now to do something that Abraham willingly did?
Oh, wow.
You see that? This is where scripture really gets exciting. We are finding out that Abraham, way before the law of Moses came, he was in obedience to God's voice, God's statutes, God's charge, God's commandments, God's laws. That's why I said, your understanding is simply an assumption. You don't have. At least I've given you one that is not enough for you. Give me one that is not enough for me. At least that says it was voluntary. Okay. I'll further try to prove to you again that he was under an order. He was under an instruction to give the 10% that he gave. The book of Genesis chapter number 14. Let's see exactly where Abraham paid tithe. And I will show you some anomalies there. Things that should help you at least extrapolate the concept, the origin of the concept, the origin. You know, what you're finding Abraham doing today, there are already signs and traces that this thing is not originating from here. You can see it's not starting now. Because that is the other argument. The other argument, Pastor, is Abraham only tithed what he got from the slaughter, having killed the kings, the spoils. He did not tithe his cattle. He did not tithe his gold. He did not tithe his silver. He only tithed what he got from the slaughter of the 4 kings. Again, that's an assumption. People are assuming that because they have no scripture that tells them that Abraham also paid from the rest of his possessions. Again, it's an assumption. You have no scripture that tells you that Abraham only tithed. What you have only is a scripture where you find Abraham paying tithe of the spoils. That is the only that you have. Okay, now, so what I said about extrapolating meaning from the text, you can see that the story between Abraham and Melchizedek is incomplete. Okay, read it, and then I'll show you something there.
From verse 1 or from verse 17?
Let's try verse 17.
Verse 17. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Chadleoma.
Yes.
And of the kings that were with him at the valley of Shaveh, which is the king's dale. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine. And he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand. And he gave him tithes of all. And the king of Sodom said unto Abram, Give me the persons and take the goods to thyself. And Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up mine hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread, even to a shoe latchet, and that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abram rich.
All right. If I'm to ask you here to pinpoint, to isolate, to single out some anomalies from this text, you are going to agree with me that when I said the scripture is half-baked, it doesn't mean that it is incorrect. It is simply proof that not everything that happened during the life of Abraham was recorded. You must understand the time of Abraham from the time he was born until he died, and the time that even Moses was born until he died. And then you look at the few pages that we have in the Bible, you can agree with me that quite a lot was left out, including the life of Jesus from the day he was born until he died. And at least that one was clearly stated that not everything that he did was recorded. Otherwise, the books would be so voluminous. The words would not contain all those activities. Right?
Yes.
So, what you're thinking is that this event that we find in chapter 14 of the book of Genesis, you are convinced by lack of evidence, you are convinced by lack of extra texts, that this was the first time that Abraham had an encounter with Melchizedek. What helps a person like me see that this was not the first time is simply because there were no introductions. How did Abraham knew this was Melchizedek? You may want to think that this was prophetic, or maybe he sensed, he discerned, but notice, he knew this man. There must have been several other encounters. That's number one. There were no introductions, yet he knew this is the king of Salem, who is also a priest. That's number one. Number two, you are further worsening the case when Abraham is to then give a tithe to a priest without being asked. Again, this shows you that he had prior knowledge. There was this similar activity every now and then. Each time Melchizedek would come to Abraham, he would get 10% from Abraham. Now, let me try to work on this one. The reason why you see Abraham only paying tithe of the spoils in chapter 14, it is because That was the only possession he had that he had not yet tithed.
Wow.
So when you say he never paid tithe of every other thing that he had, you are deriving your confidence from not having a scripture that supports that. Yet you are so confident of not having a scripture that supports your argument. But I'm also saying, why is it there were no introduction? Because that assumption is stemming from believing that Melchizedek is coming to Abraham and they are meeting for the very first time. But I'm saying, if they are meeting for the very first time, how did Abraham know that this was a Melchizedek? This is a king of Salem. This is a priest. And how did he know that this is what he has come for? Without being told. Without being told. This was a very common practice. Abraham knew who this man was because they had met before. The paying of tithe was a practice. Again, it wasn't a voluntary thing. Abraham obeyed my voice and my statutes and my commandments and my laws.
Right.
He had the laws of God. You must understand those laws so that even when we are to go back and we skip the law of Moses, we are going to land into another law that was kept by Abraham before the law of Moses. We say we are no longer under the law. Which law are we no longer under? Abraham was a law keeper. So what he was doing there was an observation of a given law by God. How would God measure the obedience of Abraham if there wasn't any law? So we are trying to debunk this idea that how come Abraham only tithed? Who said he only tithed from the spoils? Can't you see, just looking at the text, that this is not the first time that these people are coming together? And why did he only pay tithe of the spoils in chapter 14 of the book of Genesis? Because that's the only thing that he owed Melchizedek. Of everything Abraham had, he had already tithed. And the tithing was according to the laws of God. We have found a place, ladies and gentlemen, that says Abraham was under the law, not the law of Moses. It is called the law of faith. The book of Romans chapter number 3 and verse number 27.
Where is boasting then? It is excluded. By what law? Of works? Nay, but by the law of faith.
You might think that you are hearing this for the first time, but you heard me say something concerning the law of faith in our last episode.
Yes.
Why is Abraham the father of faith? This is pointing out to a certain law that we are now under, that Abraham was under. Now, read the same chapter again, chapter 3, verse number 27 of the book of Romans, because those of you that believe that you are no longer under the law, wait a moment, you're about to find out that there is this law that you never thought was a law, that even Jesus confirmed in our last episode.
Indeed.
That there is such a law. which is the law of faith. And then we will look into the requirements of faith.
Okay.
And we see if tithe is not there. Okay, read it.
Where is boasting then? It is excluded. By what law? Of works?
You see, there is a law of works. The law of works.
Nay, but by the law of faith.
But by the law of faith. So the law of faith still has some actions. Remember, the Bible talks about faith without works is dead. There are certain actions in that law of faith. Certain actions, certain duties that are supposed to be performed under that law of faith. Abraham was the father of faith, and yet there were actions involved in the practice of that kind of law. So, now, if Abraham is obeying the law, remember, the law of Moses says that you shall not take the name of the Lord in vain. Yes. I think this is the third law of the 10 Commandments. Because we are no longer under the law of Moses. Which laws are we supposed to continue keeping that were under the law of Moses, that were then confirmed by Jesus? Our duty now is to identify laws that got fulfilled by Jesus, that should no longer be kept as they were being kept under the old covenant, because they got fulfilled. Jesus came, okay, not to do away with the law, but to fulfill the law. He did not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill. What is to fulfill the law? Now, if Jesus is to come and to fulfill the law, it means the law was not full. The law was not complete. And how did he fulfill it? Did he fulfill it by taking it away? Or he fulfilled it by making it complete? How did he make it complete? So these are questions that I'm asking, and at the same time, I get on into answering them.
Thank you.
All right. So, see this. Something so profound about the law that I would want you to see. Because there is what is known to be the law of Moses, and there is also the law of Christ that we find in scriptures. I want you to look at 1 Corinthians chapter number 9, verse number 19.
For though I be free from all men,
this is Paul speaking, I'm free from all men,
yet have I made myself servant unto all.
They did not make me a servant, yes?
That I might gain the more.
You see now? That process of me voluntarily making myself a servant is so that I would gain them.
And unto the Jews I became as a Jew.
Why would a Jew speak like that? Why would a Jew speak like he was a Jew? Paul was a Jew. And he says, unto the Jews I became like a Jew. So confusing. He's simply saying, because there were Jews who were